does somebody have a glass half full perspective, right? In sales, do they get their territory and they're looking at all the reasons why their territory stinks and it's not any good? Or are they looking for opportunity and looking at the glass half full? I think attitude has everything to do with success in sales. And it's hard to gauge that in an interview, but I make it my mission to try to uncover those two things. What kind of grit do they have? And then do they view things with a glass half full mentality?
Thank you for tuning in to the Mile 40 podcast. I am Bishoy Tadros, the author of Break Barriers and Audacious, both of which are sold on Amazon. And I invite you to join me as I engage with guests to discuss those bounce back moments that we encounter on our personal journey. Mile 40 is a forum to learn about how athletes, professionals, and leaders of all backgrounds stare down moments in life where the only option is to rise up. The Mile 40 podcast strives to remind listeners that the comeback is always greater than the setback. Welcome back to another episode of the Mile 40 podcast. Thank you all for continuing to tune in. Your dedication to the show really means a lot to me. I really appreciate all the feedback, especially as we kicked off this year. If you haven't already, please be sure to hit subscribe if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. Check out the show notes, pick up a copy of Break Barriers or Audacious. I'll sign it, send it over. And right now, take a second, if you can, please drop a review for the show. It means a lot, really helps us grow. I am super excited for today's guest. Today, I have Steve Garraty. He's an advocate for embracing life with a glass half full mindset, empathy, and gratitude. His story has shaped how he's led in business, raised 2 children, and been a husband for over 30 years. Please join me in welcoming Steve, an author, leader, and champion of hope. His journey, which we're going to dive into, has led to the creation of his new book. It's called Greatfruit: How Cancer Led to Living a More Fruitful Life. Steve, thank you for joining me.
Hey, good morning, Bishoy. Thanks for having me today. Excited to be here.
Of course, of course. So you and I both connected through our professional network, and it's always really cool to me when I meet individuals like yourself with the full intention of talking shop, and within the first few minutes, we realize there's more that brings us together. There's a lot more synergy there than just our career ambitions. And so I got a quick glimpse of your story. And I'm excited to share it with our audience today. But like I do with every guest that comes on the show, I would like to paint a picture for them, give them a little bit of background about where you're from, where you grew up, and early family life, just so we get to know what childhood was like for you.
Sure. So, yeah, I was born in Chicago, moved to Connecticut. And by the time I was entering middle school, we were in Atlanta, Georgia. So I kind of consider Atlanta home. Went to middle school, high school in Atlanta, and then went to the University of Georgia. So grew up in largely in the Atlanta area.
Got it. What was family life for you like? Did you have any siblings? How was your relationship with your parents back home?
So I had my dad was a hardworking middle class, kind of rose from lower middle class to upper middle class with his work ethic. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I'm the oldest of 3, and so I've got a brother and a sister. We're about 2 years apart. Family life was good. We did a lot of camping, took a lot of family trips. My parents, I think, did a great job raising us. Part of my story, Bishoy, is that by my probably middle of high school, I started to hang out with friends that were not the best influences and really started to go down a path that wasn't very good. But I can't blame that on family circumstances. I think those were poor choices that I had made in high school.
Got it. That's good to know, and we're gonna get there. Before we get there, when you think about being the oldest, especially in a family setup like that, would you have considered yourself to be? I guess let me kind of backtrack here. The reason I'm going down the road of asking this question is because I know that in your professional career right now, you're a leader. And so I want to kind of dig into whether or not you were the leader of the pack, amongst your family, perhaps leading up to high school, amongst your siblings.
Yeah, I don't know that I was. I would say my dad was definitely a hard worker, and he rose up kind of through the ranks of corporate America, and he was always in leadership roles. I think that had an impact on me. I would not, nor would my brother or sister probably call me a leader, maybe a tormentor, but not a leader. Um, so yeah, I don't think I played that role. As a sibling for sure. It was more watching what my dad did and how he carried himself in his profession.
Got it, got it. And another reason for my line of questioning now is because when we get into those high school years, and you're not the first guest that's come on here and talked about perhaps being in the wrong environment, surrounding themselves with the wrong group of people. But there's an interesting dichotomy between the follower mindset that really comes into play when you find yourself, in those circumstances at a young age, and how sometimes the lessons of that journey turn that follower into a leader. And I think that's where we're going to end up going with this episode. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but talk to me a little bit more about those years and the types of things you got involved in.
You mean like high school and middle
High school,
school?
yeah. Let's build from there.
Yeah, I would say from a sports perspective, I ran track for my high school, and I did like YMCA type of swimming and basketball and things of that nature. I would say I was not heavily into sports. I'd say my social scene, my social friends and network was always probably my biggest driver, which again kind of led me into some trouble. But I was, I would say, one of the drivers for me, Bishoy, was always being very social and the friends and group of people that I hung out with. I'd say, especially in high school, that was always what my big motivation was.
Got it. And what do you think drove that? What was your social life like prior to high school?
So we moved a couple times, as I mentioned. I would say those were always really difficult for me. My father worked, pretty much long days. My mom is very outgoing, very social. My parents over the years have done a great job of building friendships, maintaining friendships. So I think I followed suit with them there. But I would say moving a couple times when I was 8 and then when I was 12, and then moving from, this is back in the 80s. So moving from the Northeast down to Atlanta, which was, where we lived, pretty rural country. You could probably use the word redneck at the time. Um, Area that we lived in was a big adjustment. And so that was at the age of 12, kind of right before I went into my teenage years. And I would say those two moves were probably big challenging points in my growing up, in my youth.
Got it. And what was the primary way of connecting? Was it through sport at that time, or was there anything else that kind of was your main mechanism with connecting with others?
Yeah, I've listened to some of your episodes, Bashoy, and I think a lot of your guests, you guys have talked about, kind of the coming of the smartphone and things of that nature. Back then, I'm 57, so back then there were no cell phones, and so connection was either organized sports, but largely in high school it was either getting together at somebody's house for a party where their parents were out of town, or what was very popular back then is finding a neighborhood or subdivision that was under construction, and we would find a cul-de-sac where we were kind of removed from the authorities and adults, and sometimes those would be 200 people with a bonfire, somebody's music playing out of a car stereo. But back then, when you wanted social interaction, you had to go see people. There was no phone, there was no email even, and so yeah, you had to get out and be physical with people to have social interaction.
Well, Steve, you shared your age, and you're actually not the first guest, maybe not even the second guest, in your generation to have been on mile 40. But I think because a huge contingency of their audience is probably in their, I'd say between the age of 28 and 45. I think that's probably where the main contingency is. Tell us, what back then, in your time, kids used to do to get in trouble, just so we can kind of figure out if we can relate or not.
Yeah, it was drinking was one, probably the quickest way to get in trouble. I unfortunately experienced or experimented with that at the age of, I think it was 10. It's the summer after my sixth grade. So, alcohol, and then of course drugs. I'd say back then too, drinking and driving, I wouldn't say it was accepted by any means, but it was before Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. It was back then. It was more likely you could get pulled over drinking, and the police would call your parents to come pick you up. I would say that probably never happens anymore. And so there was less awareness, maybe around drinking and driving. That was probably another area that a lot of kids would get into trouble, maybe more so back then than today.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is, and to your point, the pre-internet age, information was not moving around as quick, obviously. And so if something was a problem, whether it was, excessive drinking, drug use, whatever it may have been, knowledge wasn't spreading as quickly. And that had to have played a role as well. I'm sure, with regards to how people ended up finding out on their own that certain things maybe were not good for them. So, that kind of leads me to you. What were some of the things that you got into personally that stand out, that perhaps were, I don't know if life altering, but were moments of, oh crap, like I got myself into a mess.
You know, um, there were a number of things, like I mentioned. I think when I was at the age of 10, it's usually older siblings, right? Older siblings can get you in trouble, and I was the oldest, as I mentioned, but a friend and I were taken to his beach house, his parents' beach house, by his older sister, and she might have been a junior or senior, along with her boyfriend. I think the first night there, and again, this is summer after sixth grade. First night there, they pulled out a bag of marijuana, and basically, I guess, thought it was funny to get us to partake in that. And then the next night, they went out and bought, it might have been 12 beers, but for a 10-year-old, it doesn't take much. Um, and so that was probably the first time that I really maybe started to lose some of that innocence from childhood. The big one that happened next was the beginning of my junior year. Went out with a friend and went to my first like official party, and we were drinking whiskey from the bottle and chasing it, and basically just blacked out and woke up the next morning in my mother's car, which I had wrecked, and then my friend had wrecked it as well. Thankfully, there was no other cars or people involved. There was nobody hurt, but a lot of damage done to the car. Neither of us had ever called home to say we would not be home. That was a big turning point for me, Bishoy. That was kind of the start of, I would call it, 2 years of just constant rebellion and getting in trouble, and really pushing against any authority, whether it was my parents or school, or it didn't matter who it was.
Those moments are, looking back on it, I think we all have those moments of like, wow, like I really messed up, especially at a young age. I remember mine distinctly, and I remember the way my parents reacted, and I don't think I'll ever forget that reaction. There was definitely some fear instilled in me. I'm not going to say that because it didn't change my behavior, and it doesn't sound like your behavior changed immediately after. But now, as you reflect on it, um, you know, th- those initial those initial moments of like really bad decisions, are the moments that stick with us now, especially as you're a parent. You've been a parent for a long time, and I'm sure that as a parent, you reflect on some of the mistakes that you've made, and I'm sure it's enabled you to be a little bit more forgiving for your children as they've grown. Um, Understanding, how those mistakes end up shaping you going forward. And so you talk about the next 2 years now where there wasn't necessarily a big change in behavior. Talk to me about some of the things that went on during those next 2 years and what ultimately, toward the end of that 2 year period, became a turning point of sorts.
Yeah. So, especially my junior year, Bishoy, I had three really close friends, and the four of us did everything together, rode to school together. But we basically had this motto that we wanted to rebel, and we wanted to get in as much trouble as possible. And I would say, compared to, a lot of teenagers do that, but I would say compared to the average teenager or most of the kids at school, we took it to an extreme. So it was a lot of drinking, it was a lot of parties. Eventually, that led to, a lot of skipping school. It led to drinking before school. Um, I met my high school girlfriend, I guess, around that same time. It was actually the night that I wrecked the car for the first time, that I mentioned that turning point. Met my high school girlfriend then. She was more of a straight A student. She hung out with me and my three buddies, so it's the five of us all the time. She was kind of the voice of sanity and was always trying to keep us out of trouble. But she wasn't too successful in doing that. But, as much, so going back to what you mentioned about my parents, that first night, that was really a pivotal point with the car wreck. I felt guilty. I knew it was wrong, but at the same time, I loved all the attention I got at school for it. I enjoyed the parties. That social aspect of it was a big motivator. And so, although I felt guilt for what I had done to my parents and the worry I put them through, the expense of the car, the expense of the car insurance going up, all of that, I continued, and my behavior got worse over the next couple of years. I guess before I lead to the end of that and what the pivotal point was, which you asked, any questions on that or any?
No, you made me think of myself because when I was referring to my moment, I was 15 years old and I threw a party that turned into quite the rager at my house, while my parents were home. And it was, a complete oversight on my part because things got out of hand really quickly because this was the beginning of the age of cell phones. So words spread very, very quickly. And it wasn't just the 15 or 20 people. It ended up being, the town, the high school, everyone. And to your point, I remember how my parents reacted after one of the kids there had to go get his stomach pumped, as a result of the party. And so obviously I was in a lot of trouble. Thankfully he came out of it, okay. But the thing that made me laugh when you said, how things went for you was I remember how people reacted the next day at school. And although at home, it was unpleasant and I knew I was on really, really thin ice, at school, I finally had established myself as someone that previous to that I wasn't. And that meant a lot to me at the time. And so as you were speaking, it made me think of that, and I could relate to that. So that's all I really wanted to add there. So let's move it forward now. Talk to me about when things turned around a little bit.
Yeah, so they I guess they got worse before they got better. But yeah, my senior year, my girlfriend and I broke up a lot. I didn't deal with that very well, and we would get back together. My friend group that I mentioned my junior year, we kind of fell apart my senior year for various reasons, and I basically had to kind of start over from my close friend group. But the partying and the behavioral issues continued to get worse. My wake up call, or what that pivotal point was that changed all that, graduated from high school, was going out nightly, pretty much blacking out every night, drinking myself to the point of blacking out. Had started smoking cigarettes, was experimenting with different drugs, and I had a mass on the side of my neck, that in the beginning nobody else could see, but I could feel it when I was drinking. There was a tingling sensation. And then eventually it started to protrude outward. And eventually I ended up going in, getting it checked out. And long story short is within a matter of a few days, everybody that looked at it was concerned and ended up getting a biopsy done on July 3rd, right after I graduated high school. And the next day, the surgeon called our house to inform us that I had Hodgkin's, which is a form of cancer. Um, the Just to give you an idea, Bishoy, of where I was at in life, part of that conversation was you're not allowed to drink anymore, potentially ever again. And that's what I was upset about. That's when I started crying. That's when I was fixated on that. And so after that phone call, we gathered around the table, my mother, my father, and my two siblings. And of course, they were all shook by the news of the cancer. I was just, my world was rocked that lifestyle had to come to an end, which I still clung to it for a few weeks, but that's what I was upset about. So then I had to go in and get further tests to figure out how far it had spread. And it had spread, it was in my neck, obviously. It had spread to my chest and stomach. It was stage 3. And so the chemotherapy was recommended as the path of treating it. And I ended up doing chemotherapy for about 9 to 10 months.
Wow. So we're going to go back to the chemo and the cancer, but I want to go to you and your family around the table, and then you digesting that, you had to give up the lifestyle. The topic of alcohol has come up several times on this show. I feel like we beat it to death with the audience, and they might even be rolling their eyes at this point around the story. But every story is unique, and I think yours is different because that diagnosis also came at a young age. You weren't a drinker in middle age, a heavy drinker in middle age. You weren't. You were still kind of at this pivotal juncture of still figuring out who you were and what your identity was, and what you were meant to do here. You weren't even were you, correct me if I'm wrong, you weren't a working professional at that point.
No, I was not. I was set to go off to college in the fall.
Yeah. So one of the consistent themes around alcohol on this show is the fact that in a sense, it's a mask, right? And so, when you think about losing that, you're losing this persona that you had out in the world. And you're losing this identity that had you on a high for, again, a very important part of your life socially. Um, you know, when you think about that, and when you think about um, losing that, you think about how hard it is to potentially go on, because it's defined you for so long. So I want to just narrow in on that aspect for a little bit. Talk to me about how your mind worked around understanding that you no longer could. And was it easy? Did you have any setbacks on that trail, or were you disciplined enough to understand I don't really have a choice here?
Yeah, so my identity, I guess, is what felt threatened, right? To your point, it's what everybody back then did. I shouldn't say everybody, but most of
A lot
us.
of people, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, like I said, every Friday, Saturday night, it was gathering either at somebody's house or at a cul-de-sac party. And so not drinking would make that situation awkward, right? And it would make it, being around a lot of other drunk kids when you can't drink. So I tried to cling to that a little bit. I went to, I think it was 2 additional parties after my diagnosis. And, I believe to this day, I've never confirmed this, but I believe my parents had told the surgeon about my issues and my behavior, because the surgeon had gone out of the way to stress, no drinking, no drugs. And then the first time we met with the oncologist, same thing. I got similar speech, which I'm sure they don't give to everybody. And so I went to 2 additional parties, and I was told, like, hey, if you drink, you're going to die, right? Like, you got to focus on your health, your recovery. When you drink, it lowers your immune system. It affects your white cell count that's going to fight the chemo or fight the cancer cells. And so you got to focus on being the best you can be from a health perspective. And so I tried to, I thought that I could go to parties and still have a good time. And I quickly learned I was tempted on one of those where I dipped tobacco, and my friends were like, hey, they never said you couldn't dip tobacco. And then, of course, they poured some alcohol in the tobacco, and I put that in my mouth. The minute I did, the room started to spin, and I was like, it hit me then that I had to be smarter. I had to be more disciplined. And then that same evening when we left there, Bishoy, there was a car accident about a mile from the party, and there were 3 people laid out on the ground, and there was an ambulance there. They all survived, but all 3 of them went to our high school, had left that party, and gotten in a very serious car accident. One of them was physically disabled permanently after that. But we drove past that. And again, this was after my diagnosis, after I had dipped tobacco. And it kind of shocked all of us, but I think it hit me especially hard. And that evening, driving, and we were in my dad's convertible. I was designated driver. We just, cranked up tunes and drove through backcountry roads in Atlanta. And we were all kind of processing what had happened to these 3 people we knew at school. We didn't know the outcome then at the point, but we knew it was bad. But it really hit me like, I've got to leave this life behind. I got to focus on my health. And so, yeah, there were a couple times where I tried to cling to that prior life, and it was difficult to let it go. But it was really easy after everybody started heading off to college. I was kind of left in my hometown. Most everybody that I had hung out with was going off to enjoy the college life and the Greek life and things of that nature. And my battle was just getting into the thick of it at that time.
What would you say was your biggest stressor to that point in life before the diagnosis?
It was probably tension that I had with my parents over my behavior. It was tension with my first serious girlfriend, and we were like on again, off again. I didn't handle any of that well, so I didn't handle that stress very well at all. And then I would say kind of the breakup of my core friend group. So all of that going on over the course of a year or so, those were my biggest stressors. Again, my social life was my biggest driver, and all of that was being rocked from different angles. That was the biggest stressor on me.
If you know me, you know that I like to look good and feel good. As an endurance athlete who trains daily, I need my wardrobe to fit the mold. Roan creates performance-driven clothing for your active lifestyle. Each piece is designed for versatility and made with integrity to outfit you for an active life lived on your own terms. The Roan promise is to help you move forever forward. Use code MILE40 for 20% off online and in-store for new customers only. Visit www.rhone.com, that's Rhone spelled RHONE, or find your local store and move forever forward starting today. This is a tough question, and perhaps you won't have an answer to this question. And I feel like a lot of people at that age might not have an answer to this question. But were you comfortable looking in the mirror and identifying, who you were, or were you lost in a sense in terms of figuring out, especially as you navigate tensions with all these different dynamics?
Yeah, I had no 1-year plan. I had no 5-year plan. I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. I lived for the weekend and the social interactions and seeing friends and getting out of the house. I lived for those moments, Bishoy. I didn't really think long term. I know for a fact I did not have any goals or ambition. I do believe the cancer diagnosis saved me. I do think something terrible was going to happen. I ended up wrecking my parents' cars 5 times over the 2 years, my junior and senior year, all under the influence of something. And so I do think my path was headed down a pretty bad path, and there would have been a bad outcome had cancer not intervened.
Out of curiosity, were you a good student?
I could get away with going to class and listening, and I would make B's and C's. Had I applied myself, I think probably would have made A's and B's.
Got it. Okay, so now going back 9 months of treatment, and regardless of age, regardless of where you are, chemo is not easy. The impact that it has on your body, it's not as much as you can read it in a textbook and think you understand it. I think there's something that bonds people that have been through it, because you know, eh, there's it's a lot worse than it sounds when you think about when you talk about the side effects, when you talk about how it impacts your body on a day-to-day basis and how it impacts your overall uh, emotional well-being as well as your physical well-being. Your body it's falling apart during treatment essentially. So talk to me a little bit about how your mindset shifted during treatment.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I don't think you can put in words what a hellacious experience it is. Um, I think some of the drugs they've come out with to treat some of the side effects have gotten better, but it's still an awful cancer is an awful thing, and chemotherapy is really difficult. My first treatment, Bishoy, I didn't get sick. I mentioned I went to two parties after I was diagnosed. One of those was the evening that I received my first chemo treatment. So I started to get, as a teenager, you're graduating high school, there's a sense of being invincible. I think most people have. I certainly had that. Cancer was a wake up call and kind of shattered that illusion. But after my first chemo treatment and I didn't get sick, I started to think maybe it was just old people that got sick and this was going to be a lot easier. I got a little cocky again, started thinking that, that this was going to be a much easier path. So I went out that evening, and that was the evening that I mentioned earlier. Um, the second chemo treatment. So I went in every 2 weeks. I would sit in a chair for about an hour, and they would hook up an IV, and the chemo drugs would drip in. The second one, I ended up, vomiting about halfway through that, all over myself, all over the floor. You couldn't get up because you had an IV in your arm, and you had to sit still. And then basically, I went home and hugged the toilet, puking until there was nothing left to come out. Sorry to be so graphic, but to answer your question, it's pretty graphic. And then eventually you've just got the bile coming up, and it's the worst feeling. But I would go in the morning first thing, and it got worse progressively on each treatment. But I would go in, usually be home by about 10 a.m., and then it was usually 10 p.m. before that stopped, and I was able to get back in my bed. But it was tough. I mean, that was just the physical reaction to the chemotherapy, and then there were side effects. I lost all my hair. I used to have hair. I lost all my hair. Had real bad mouth sores. Number of different side effects. But the mental part that you mentioned, that was worse than any of the physical, because that gets progressively worse. And knowing it's like going to the dentist and for a root canal and having to go in every 2 weeks. It just gets progressively worse, and it wears you down.
Yeah. You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, given how your social life drove a lot of the decisions that you had made up until that point in your life, it really speaks volumes around who was still around as you were probably navigating this circumstance. And I'm interested to hear from you, outside of your parents, who I'm assuming were around, and, I'll let you kind of correct me if I was wrong. Uh, was there anyone else there uh, who perhaps stuck around, or maybe showed you a different side of them as being more than just a drinking buddy at that point?
Yeah, stuck around's a good term. It was again, being that most of my friendships revolved around drinking and going out. Most of those kind of disappeared, and Looking back now, I don't blame a lot of those folks. I mean, they were in the prime of their life, having fun and kind of taking care of a cancer patient is not high on anybody's list at the age of 18. Most of them headed off to their respective college towns. But there were my family, so my parents, my siblings, some of my extended family. My parents were saints. I mean, they took me to every appointment. They did everything for me during that process. Um, but I had two friends that both stuck by me during that time. And I say stuck by me, I mean, drove me to school, drove me to work. I was able to maintain a light college course load at community college. I had a part time job. They would take me out, they would make me laugh. They were two people that I could talk to. They were fantastic friends. Both were in my wedding, I was in their wedding. Um, but they were phenomenal. There was a nurse that was incredible, that went above and beyond, the duty of being a nurse. Um, Developed a friendship with her over time. So those would be some of the people I would call out that kind of were there for me during my battle.
As I kind of again continue to hear you speak, I just hear as you speak, I think about myself a lot because I relate with you a lot around this. Um, I think back to you don't realize in the moment as you're navigating something so difficult, such an adverse circumstance, something so dark, it's even hard to appreciate those people in the moment, while they're with you, while they're supporting you, while they're saying all the right things. Now I think back and I think about my parents in particular and the role that they played during my journey, that I was probably not very appreciative of at the time, but now, they absolutely changed my perspective on how to navigate difficult circumstances as a result of the way that they played their role during that period. um as I'm hearing you speak, I want to ask, at what point is the ball rolling in your head that this will pass? At what point are you getting good news from the doctors? And are you at any point determined, if not, you know, feeling more equipped and resilient to navigate life completely differently, once afforded the opportunity?
Yeah, it was that was difficult. I would say with about because you don't really know, right? When you're going
You
through a
don't.
cancer treatment, you don't know when the end is. The
No.
end comes when
When they
they do
tell
the
you.
test. Yeah, when they tell you it's over and that they've gotten it all, and they don't necessarily know that. In fact, with each patient, they don't know how well you're going to respond to the chemotherapy or the radiation, whatever the treatment is. And so I never knew when the end was, but with about 2 to 3 treatments left, not knowing that I had that many left, there was a situation where I broke down outside the office before I had to go in and get another treatment. And I basically asked my mother to go inside, check us in, and I would be in when I was ready. And I sat in the parking lot for about an hour. I thought about quitting. I thought about, like, I can't do this anymore. That mental wear down over the course of, by then it had been about 9 months. It was tough. And I think for me, there was a moment in the parking garage where I hit rock bottom. I think that was my rock bottom. And I was praying, I was crying, I was despondent. And there was a moment where I felt relief and a sense that somebody was supporting me. And I think that God at that moment kind of showed himself. And I was able to eventually get the strength after about an hour and go back inside and get that next chemo treatment. I think that for me was a little bit of a turning point. I wasn't like, yeah, I'm ready to take on the rest of this, and let's, it still was extremely difficult. But after that, I had a couple more treatments, and I did what I had to do, and I got through it. But for me, I felt like God supported me kind of when I did hit rock bottom. Um, a lot of the values or benefits that I got from my experience with cancer, because I do this to this day, I believe it was a blessing. It saved my life, but it also, I think, made me a better father, a better husband, a better business leader. a lot of the values that came out of that, I didn't recognize while I was in it. I was trying to survive. I was trying to get through it. I was just trying to beat cancer. That's all I cared about. But over time, I kind of learned that there were a lot of values from that experience that made me a better person.
Well, for the lack of a better word, I don't know if you agree with this, but I feel like once it's done and you get the green light and the clean bill of health, there's a little bit of a hangover period. At least I experienced it. And when I what I mean by that, for lack of a better word again, is that it's kind of like, what the hell just happened? Like, what did I just go through? Right. And how am I going to step back outside? And can I talk about this? And, you know, will anyone understand? And I don't want to skip too far ahead, but for context, Steve, like, I didn't really publicly talk about my story for about 17 years after I got my clean bill of health. And I had it at at a much younger age than you when I went through it. Although treatment and my last surgery lasted a while, so I was finally, green lit when I was 13. Um, but it took me 17 years to process it. Did you have to navigate, this quote unquote hangover period after getting a clean bill of health, or was it different for you since you kind of were a little bit older?
No, that's interesting. You share that, and I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, I had something similar. I was 18. I was excited to head off to college, and I wanted to experience college, and I wanted to live like a normal kid that all my friends were experiencing. I did know I did head off to college. I joined a fraternity, but I knew I had to kind of do things differently. I couldn't live the lifestyle. I never did go back to that lifestyle. But when I got up to college, I pledged a fraternity. I met, one of my pledge brothers and I became quick best friends. And I remember we were walking on campus and I told him, hey, by the way, this is what happened to me over the course of the last year. And cancer is a scary word. And I just remember his reaction. He was uncomfortable. He wasn't comfortable talking about it. He didn't know what to say. It became really awkward and not his fault, right? Like kids don't want to talk about cancer. It's a downer. It's depressing. And so I didn't bring it up again with him or anybody else. And it's funny now that I got this book coming out, I've got people from college, like I had no clue. And they're like, apologizing to me, like, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I was like, you didn't know that because I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted to go experience college life just like you. And I didn't want everybody looking at me like a victim or you know, like they needed to have sympathy for me. But yeah, I would say that kind of sharing where I did not get the reaction I was looking for, it probably put me in that spot that you described, Bishoy, where you were in, where I didn't feel comfortable sharing it. It wasn't until probably, maybe for me, it was about 8 to 10 years later that I started to share it and be more open about it.
Yeah. No, the irony is you got a lot out of your system before your diagnosis. Whereas I was so young that when I got out of my diagnosis and got the green light, I just wanted to be normal at that point. Like I wanted to party and I started drinking a couple of years later and I started partying a couple of years later because I had felt like up until that point in my life nothing was normal. Whereas you got a lot of it out of your system at a younger age, but it still doesn't make it easier because I mean, I don't know what Georgia was like back then, but I know, just from being a college football fan, I can only imagine, Georgia's got a lot going on. And I don't did you drink in college at that point? Like, did you go back to even, like, lightly drinking, or were you sober?
So no, I drank, but I've pretty much stayed off liquor. There might be a couple exceptions over the last whatever 40 years, but yeah, I didn't go back to liquor because liquor was I drink a lot. I go to a restaurant, I'll drink five iced teas, right? I've got a drink in my hand. I'm drinking consistently. And so liquor was one of those that sneaks up on you and I would black out and I would just, I didn't have the control. So I never went back to liquor, but I did drink beer. I did have a good time. I did party, but I was much more, restrained in the way that I went about doing that. And I was more concerned about my health. was careful not to put myself in stressful situations because I don't think I handled stress well in high school. But yeah, I had a great time. And to answer your question, Georgia still a fun school, but back then it was it wasn't quite Animal House if you've seen the movie, but it was close. It was every football game. It was band parties and you bring a date and yeah, it was a great experience. But I did it more responsibly than I went through high school.
Got it, got it. No, thank you for the context there. Um, well, I think a natural question is when you think about Steve in college versus Steve in high school, and cancer kind of coming right there at that very crucial interjection. How would you describe how your priorities perhaps shifted? Sure, your behavior shifted. You became a little bit more responsible. You became a little bit more aware. Maybe it was a result of a major health scare, but was your overall perspective shifted at that point, or was it still figuring itself out?
It definitely shifted. I would say the number one thing that really jumps out to your question is gratitude. And so I enjoyed college. The social aspect was still important to me. And after cancer is pretty lonely. You probably agree with that, Bishoy.
Yeah,
It's
of
it's
course.
your circle of influences is much smaller when you're going through something like that. And so I went from this situation in high school socially to this year of hell and kind of being just a few people in my life, and then going off to college and joining a fraternity with 120 guys and making fast friends with a lot of people and going out on dates all the time. It was a lot of fun, but I would say gratitude. Like I appreciated that. I felt like at a level above everybody else because I had just been through hell in my mind. And now I was like, wow, I'm getting to do all these things and experience the fun part of college. But I would say gratitude was one. And then I think empathy was another. There's so many aspects of when you're sick with cancer that I learned to be empathetic towards others. I mean, one, you don't always know what people are going through. You pass somebody on the street, or scream at somebody in a road rage incident. You don't know what they're going through, and so I think for me it provided a lot of empathy. I remember sitting around that dining room table with my family, and outside of being upset I couldn't drink again, the other feeling that I had was empathy towards my mom who couldn't control herself. She was crying so much. My brother, who was extremely emotional. Um, and so there was a very heightened sense of empathy in watching their reactions and then seeing how my parents did a 180. I mean, I say a 180, they always love me and care for me, but they had every reason to. In fact, they did look at military school. They had every reason to probably kick me out of the house. But the minute I got sick, they did what great parents do. I mean, they they were saints, and so there was a sense of empathy due to so many reasons and experiences of having cancer. Um, so empathy was really big, and then just the importance of family and friends. I consider myself a great networker. I keep in touch with people. My family makes fun of, I keep in touch with it, whether it be a neighbor that I lived next to 30 years ago or somebody I worked with for 3 months in my first job. I try to build and then maintain relationships. And I probably do a lot to keep in touch with people and make sure those relationships continue. That's something else I think that kind of came out of my experience with cancer. Um, those would be some of the things in the ways that it changed me and how I approached college differently than high school.
You know, look, c- cancer makes you grow up really fast. I don't think there's any way around it, right? Because a lot of times those are lessons that people learn even at an older age. Those are lessons that they learn by the time, they're settled down, perhaps have kids, thinking about how their parents raised them. And then, I think I could speak to it because I'm a young father. Like the level of gratitude went up 100-fold once I had kids because you realize what your parents had to navigate to raise you. And the cancer speeds up that process because with cancer, you you experience and you see some darkness that you don't really want to wish on anyone else. And that enables you then to go forward with life with that sentiment of gratitude, A, because you're no longer there, and B, that you know that life could be a lot worse than it is, as it is right now. So thank you for enlightening us and sharing that with us. So, two things I want to touch up on, as we kind of round out on time here. Um, we of course want to touch on the book that's going to be coming out soon and the process and the journey of writing that book. But I also want to talk about how you've employed those lessons as you've navigated your career. Because, like I alluded to earlier on this episode, you're a leader, and I could speak from a complete unbiased perspective. And the reason I reached out to you the very first time you and I spoke, again, had nothing to do with this conversation. It's because people say he's a good leader. And so that tells me something. So let's maybe start there. Let's talk about career. Give us the quick career timeline, and talk to me about when leadership became a part of that trajectory.
Yeah, so I came out of college, went into sales, and thrived in sales roles. I had two roles, two different companies, two roles, totaling about 5, 6 years. And I always enjoyed helping the new person, right? The person who was trying to figure out the job. I enjoyed taking potential hires and new hires out in the field with me. So I really enjoyed the teaching and training and helping aspect. I do believe in my heart that a lot of that ties back to cancer and the people that kind of stood up and did things for me. I always had a heightened appreciation for that, and in a way, I want to give back. So I enjoyed that. I was always volunteering as a salesperson to help my manager in those roles, and then eventually I went into a leadership role. It was a hell of a lot harder than I ever thought it was going to be. My first year, I probably made every mistake in the book, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed seeing somebody um, start with our company, whatever company I was with, but start in a role and then end up doing better than they ever imagined that they could, not just in the role, but in life, maybe purchasing their first house, starting a family. And I've always considered it a lot of fun to play a small role in that and making a difference in people's lives. So at this point, I've been in different leadership roles for over 20 years. Um, I love it. I love coaching and developing and see people thriving.
I don't know about you, but my cancer experience has really led me um, to really lean into the value and putting my money on the underdog, meaning that because of what I had navigated, uh, the countless voices that speak about how challenging it is to overcome a cancer battle, the murmurs of this isn't going to be good, or this could end up poorly, and the self-doubt that creeps in during that journey, and then ultimately you realize that you have strength that perhaps you never thought that you had, despite the fact that, yes, your parents are like, hey, like, you're gonna make it, you're strong, and saying all the right things. You still don't really know if you're as strong as those people who are close to you say, because they're supposed to say those things. And the reason I say this is because when I think about my career, and when I think about how I would lead, and when I think about some of the business decisions that I make, I'm really big on taking a gamble on the people who perhaps don't have the prettiest resumes, um, because I do think that the reward could be a lot higher. Talk to me about how and if cancer impacted your belief in the underdog.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never thought of it as like an underdog. I'd say there's two qualities that I usually love when I'm interviewing people and will draw me towards hiring somebody. One is that grit and determination, and kind of, I like to ask the question, what's the worst thing you've ever been through? How'd you handle it? you and I sharing our cancer experience. I was in an interview myself one time, and the person said, he's kind of basically saying you grew up in this country club and you kind of had a silver spoon in your mouth, and I don't think you've got the toughness. I don't think you, and I literally had to stop myself from laughing because I was like, let me tell you about the worst thing I've ever been through. And it got me the job. He was kind of smiling and he was like, okay, you got me there. But I like to know, like, what's somebody been through and do they have that grit and tenacity to get through? Because any new job, you're always going to hit highs and lows, especially in that first 6 to 12 months when you're learning something new. And having that grit and tenacity and that work ethic to work through it. But the second one I would say is attitude and mindset. There was a book I read during my battle with cancer called Getting Well Again, and it's all on the mindset and attitude and how that one contributes to people getting sick, but two contributes to your chances of getting healthy. And there's a lot of stats in there. It's a great book. I reread it when I was writing my book. Um, but I like to look at, like, does somebody have a glass half full perspective, right? In sales, do they get their territory and they're looking at all the reasons why their territory stinks and it's not any good? Or are they looking for opportunity and looking at the glass half full? I think attitude has everything to do with success in sales. And it's hard to gauge that in an interview, but I make it my mission to try to uncover those two things. What kind of grit do they have? And then do they view things with a glass half full mentality?
Agreed. No, thank you for sharing those tidbits because I do think that's something that could really be takeaways for the listeners here, right? Like, and I think that when you think about grit and attitude, sometimes those two things might sound cliche to some people, but you have to understand that everybody, including the people across from you that are doing the hiring, have their own journeys, have their own stories. And I was listening to a podcast today that was talking about interviews and what hiring managers are really looking for, and it's really you're essentially looking for pieces of yourself sometimes subconsciously when you're interviewing people, and knowing that what you've gone through, you needed to employ grit. You needed to adjust your attitude, uh, and that allowed you to overcome the most difficult period of your life. It makes sense that those are two of the things that you look for people that you want on your team. And so, I think powerful and great tangible takeaways for the guests here. I know we're tight on time, Steve, so I want to make sure. Let's talk about Grapefruit. Talk to me about when the book process started for you, and now that it's close to becoming a reality. Let's talk about you know your your key goal, not in terms of sales or anything like that, but what is the message that you want to make sure people get from Grapefruit?
Yeah. So it started as I like to joke, which is, it's not really a joke, it's true, but I like to joke. It's taken me 37 years to write it. It started as a journal when I was going through chemo. My parents, my therapist at the time, had recommended, like, write in a journal. It's therapeutic. It'll help. So I did that. So it started with a notebook filled with just notes on what I was going through. Like you mentioned, after cancer, I wanted to kind of forget about it and go live like a normal kid. But in my 20s, when I got out of college, I took some writing courses and I started thinking, I want to make this maybe a book or make it, more organized. When I had children, that was another pivotal point where I wanted to leave my story to them. And for a long time, that was my goal, was to leave my story with them, some of the lessons that I learned having gone through cancer. Eventually, I felt like I had a really good story. Bishoy, I was, the SAT, I did really well on math, not in English. I don't consider myself a writer, but I felt like I had a really good story. The other pivotal point was COVID. When COVID hit, I was traveling less. I travel a lot in sales leadership. I'm always on the road. So I was at home more. I had more time to finish the book. But also there were a lot of themes with COVID, that life is short, that I think we all experienced. It resonated with me with the book. And I felt like God was telling me, finish this book. And so I did. I finished writing it in 2020. I invested a lot in editors because, again, I don't consider myself a writer per se, but I knew I had the story to tell. And so the last 3 years primarily have been, editing, cover design, marketing the book. And so it comes out March 11th. I'm really excited about it. But eventually it pivoted from a story I can leave my kids to, I think this is a pretty good story that can impact others. And that goes to the last part of your question. What I'm hoping to do with this book is we all are going to face crappy points in life, right? It's not a question of if, it's when. And I'm hoping that people can read my book and approach those and exit those crappy points in life, those big hurdles that we're all going to have to jump over, that they can exit those with a mindset of growth and transformation and how can I become a better person, having gone through this divorce or job loss or grief of losing somebody or a cancer diagnosis, because that's what it did for me. And I've gotten some really good early feedback on the book from people that have read it, that it's helped them in how they view life's setbacks. So
I
that's
think
that's
that's beautiful, Steve. And like honestly, like again, hearing you talk, I love the way that you wrote it in a way where it's not just geared toward the cancer journey, right? Like it's geared toward, like you said, people navigating hardships such as divorce. That was very central to what I was trying to do with my first book, Break Barriers. I didn't want it to be about people just battling cancer. I understand how cancer played a very important role, but to your point, the lessons and the takeaways could be applied in all arenas of life. And so writing your book with that kind of intent, speaks volumes to you in the sense that you want to not only reach a wider audience for your message, but because you have come to understand you can apply the lessons of your journey in all areas of your own life. And by doing so, you're setting an example for your children. You're empowering the people who roll under you in a professional setting, and you're lighting up the world around you on a day-to-day basis. And I think that that in and of itself, is quite the objective. My last question to you is around how cathartic was the process of writing the book, right? Like, I think people sometimes don't realize that when you're writing a book so personal, and a book that is so grounded in your own personal journey, your adversity, and the lessons that you've learned, you start to uncover lessons that maybe you didn't even think about at the time. And as you're writing, more and more it comes out. And sometimes you're even fighting with yourself, like, should I share this? Should I not share this? Like, is this too personal? Is this not, is this okay for the public to read? And letting go of that, for me at least, was an incredibly revealing process. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Probably over the last 6 to 12 months, my wife has probably said a dozen times, "Are you sure you want to put this book out there?" Like, there's a lot of stuff in here. It's pretty personal. I think a great story, especially a memoir, right, where you're telling your story. I think it's best when it's raw and it's vulnerable and you're putting it all out there. We see enough sugar coated stuff on social media, right, where everybody's putting out the best parts of their life. I think a compelling story is being raw and vulnerable. There's a chapter in the book. I don't want to mention what it's about. I'll leave it for people who want to read the book, but it's very personal, and it really, it took a lot for me to write this chapter, and I wrote it not intending to put it in the book. And actually, a gentleman who I've worked with at 3 companies now, he works with my current employer as well. We were having drinks one night. I was telling him about this chapter and that I was not going to put in the book. And he was like, "This is hilarious. It's funny. And it's also vulnerable. People are going to want to hear this. And it makes your story like that much more endearing." And so I thought about it. It was kind of a difficult choice, but I said, I'm going to put it in there. And I'm glad I did. I think the story is me. It's raw. It's vulnerable. I'm putting it all out there. And I think that makes for a better, more entertaining story.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, Steve, I want to thank you for your rawness and your vulnerability on this episode. It really means a lot to me. Not only that you take the time, but that you allow us in, you open up. You share your experiences, and you bring us right there with you. I think that's one of the key features that distinguishes how episodes perform. Does the listener feel like they're in the room with you? And in this case, I most certainly feel like I was there with you throughout this journey. So I want to thank you for coming on, for sharing with me, and for the audience. And I wish you nothing but the best of luck as you move forward with the upcoming release.
Yeah, thanks, Bishoy. I'd say a lot of that is attributed to your style and doing these episodes. You get people to share in a way that is special. So thank you very much. I appreciate being a guest on your show.
You got it. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode of the Mile 40 podcast, go ahead, subscribe, leave a review, and share the word. Thank you for being a part of the Mile 40 family. And let's unite in showing the world that comebacks are always greater than setbacks.